January 23, 1987, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, New York City. Aretha Franklin stood backstage in an elegant gown, moments away from making history that would echo through generations. Tonight, she would become the first woman ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, shattering a glass ceiling that had existed since the institution's founding. But this wasn't just about breaking barriers. It was about finally acknowledging that the Queen of Soul had been the architect of rock and roll's emotional foundation from the very beginning. This is the story of how one night changed not just Aretha's legacy, but the entire understanding of women's role in shaping the music that defined American culture. But to understand the magnitude of this moment, you have to understand how systematically women had been excluded from rock and roll's official narrative. When the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was established in 1983, its mission was to honor the artists who had created and shaped this revolutionary musical form. Yet year after year, the inductees were almost exclusively men, as if women had been mere observers rather than active creators of this musical revolution that had transformed global culture. The irony was staggering. Rock and roll had emerged from rhythm and blues, gospel and soul music, genres where women like Aretha Franklin, Mahalia Jackson, and Ruth Brown had been not just participants, but pioneers and innovators. Aretha's own contributions to rock and roll were undeniable. Her powerful voice had influenced everyone from Janis Joplin to Robert Plant. Her piano playing had inspired countless rock musicians, and her arrangements had created templates that rock bands would follow for decades. The selection process for Aretha's induction had been contentious within the Hall of Fame's nominating committee. Some members argued that she was primarily a soul and R&B artist, as if these genres existed in isolation from rock and roll, rather than being its essential building blocks. Others questioned whether women belonged in an institution dedicated to rock and roll, revealing the deep-seated gender bias that had shaped the music industry's understanding of its own history. Aretha herself had mixed feelings about the honor. On one hand, she recognized the historical significance of being the first woman inducted and understood that her presence would open doors for other female artists who deserved recognition. On the other hand, she was frustrated that it had taken 4 years for the Hall of Fame to acknowledge that women had played crucial roles in creating rock and roll, and that she was being honored as much for her gender as for her undeniable musical contributions. The ceremony itself was a celebration of Aretha's extraordinary career, but it was also a reckoning with the music industry's treatment of women. When Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards introduced her, he acknowledged that rock and roll would not exist without the gospel and soul traditions that Aretha had mastered and transformed. His words carried weight because they came from someone whose own musical identity had been shaped by the traditions that Aretha represented. The atmosphere in the Waldorf Astoria ballroom was electric with anticipation as Aretha approached the podium. Music industry executives, fellow artists, and critics who had witnessed decades of systemic exclusion understood they were witnessing a historic correction. The applause that greeted her was not just appreciation for her artistry, but recognition of a long-overdue acknowledgement of women's fundamental role in shaping American popular music. Aretha's acceptance speech was both gracious and pointed. She thanked the Hall of Fame for the honor while subtly acknowledging the historical oversight that had made her the first woman inducted. She spoke about the gospel roots of rock and roll, the contributions of women who had been overlooked, and her hope that future inductees would better reflect the diversity of artists who had shaped this music. Her words were diplomatic but carried an unmistakable message about justice and recognition. The performance that followed her induction speech was legendary. Aretha took the stage and delivered a medley that showcased both her versatility and her influence on rock music. She performed gospel-tinged versions of rock standards, demonstrating how the spiritual intensity of her church background had provided emotional depth that rock musicians had been trying to capture for decades. The audience of music industry luminaries was visibly moved by the power and authenticity of her performance. The evening's significance extended beyond the ceremony itself. Television coverage of the event reached millions of viewers who witnessed this barrier-breaking moment. inspiring young women musicians who saw possibilities they hadn't imagined before. The image of Aretha Franklin holding her Rock and Roll Hall of Fame trophy became iconic, representing not just individual achievement, but collective progress toward recognition and equality in the music industry. Behind the scenes, the induction ceremony represented a shift in how the music industry understood its own history. Aretha's presence forced a re-evaluation of the artificial boundaries that had been drawn between genres, and a recognition that women had been essential to rock and roll's development from its earliest days. Her induction created momentum for other female artists to receive the recognition they deserved, fundamentally changing the Hall of Fame's approach to future selections. The media coverage of Aretha's induction reflected the complexity of the moment. Music journalists praised the Hall of Fame for finally acknowledging women's contributions, while also noting how long it had taken for this recognition to occur. Aretha herself was celebrated not just as a groundbreaking inductee, but as an artist whose influence on rock music had been profound and lasting, regardless of how her music had been categorized by record companies and radio programmers. The impact of Aretha's induction extended far beyond that single night. Her presence in the Hall of Fame legitimized the claims of other female artists who had been overlooked and created pressure for more inclusive recognition practices. In subsequent years, artists like Ruth Brown, Laverne Baker, and Etta James would receive the acknowledgement they deserved. But Aretha's induction had been the catalyst for this overdue recognition. The significance of breaking this particular glass ceiling resonated with women across the music industry who had faced similar barriers in their own careers. Aretha's induction proved that excellence could not be ignored indefinitely, and that institutional change was possible when pressure for justice became impossible to resist. Her presence in the Hall of Fame represented victory not just for her personally, but for all the women who had contributed to rock and roll's development. Looking back, Aretha Franklin's 1987 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction stands as a watershed moment in music history, the night when an institution finally acknowledged what had been obvious to music lovers for decades: that women had been central to rock and roll's creation and development. The Queen of Soul had always belonged in any honest accounting of rock music's greatest artists, and her induction forced the music world to confront its own biases and oversights. The long-term consequences of that historic evening extended far beyond the music industry itself. Aretha's breakthrough inspired women in countless other fields who had faced similar institutional barriers, proving that persistence and undeniable talent could eventually overcome even the most entrenched systems of exclusion. Her dignified handling of the moment provided a model for how to accept recognition, while acknowledging the systemic problems that had made such recognition so long in coming. The transformation of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in subsequent years validated the significance of Aretha's pioneering induction. Within a decade, the institution had inducted dozens of female artists who had been overlooked during its early years, fundamentally changing the narrative of rock music history to more accurately reflect the contributions of all the artists who had shaped this revolutionary musical form. The woman who walked onto that Waldorf Astoria stage had spent decades proving that talent transcended genre boundaries and gender expectations. Her induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was not just recognition of her individual achievements, but acknowledgement that the history of rock music could not be told honestly without recognizing the essential contributions of women who had shaped its sound, spirit, and emotional power from the very beginning. Aretha Franklin had not just broken a barrier that night, she had opened a door that would never be closed again.